Welcome to the Thinking the Unthinkable podcast, our latest leadership conversation. Hello, I'm Nik Gowing. It's easy to default to being gloomy. Reversing so many negatives in nature, biodiversity, and climate does not come easy. But increasingly, data confirms positives being achieved in the right direction. This is in ways most people are not aware of. Glowing examples should create cautious but growing optimism. That's what we want to focus on and highlight today. To do that, I'm joined by Sherry Madera, who's Chief Executive of CDP. That's the Carbon Disclosure Project. Well, the label sounds a bit geeky, but for 25 years, CDP has done fantastic work collecting data. They've summarized their findings in this heartening corporate health check, the annual state of Earth positive business action. Remarkably, 2/3 of the world's companies by value, some 25,000 major companies, have provided their data. What's important is that when companies report their data on becoming Earth positive, they then realize what they are emitting. Within 2 years, their emissions drop by 7 to 10%. In other words, disclosure drives action. And you say, Sherry, costs have been reduced by a staggering $13 billion. So, Sherry, a very warm welcome. Disclosure drives action. Why do you say that?
Thank you very much for having me, Nick. And it's a really important time to make sure that we were thinking about the positive as well as, being worried about what's happening in the world. Disclosure drives action. We've been doing this at CDP for 25 years. And what we're really seeing is once you measure something, you can manage it. This is a business reality, and it is holding true when you start thinking about your sustainability data. So when you're thinking about emissions, when you're thinking about impacts on the earth, thinking about your water usage, how it is you interact with land, how it is that you're thinking about waste management, all of these things are data points that you as a business can consider how it is not just as a nice to have piece of data, but how it affects your core business. And that's something that companies increasingly are addressing at speed.
Now, in your 4 core findings in the report, which I have here, you conclude that, quote, protecting the planet while pursuing profit is possible. Why do you say that?
Well, what we did, and you're right in saying this is our first global health check, corporate health check, but we, of course, have had 20 years worth of data that has been contributing to it. And so we feel really positive and confident the fact that we can really link 4 key levers in terms of corporates being able to move forward with a good, sustainable business, and that doesn't affect their valuations and their market capitalization. And those 4 things in summary are, and hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about them a little bit more. First is linking executive pay to sustainability goals. The second is including internal carbon pricing in the way that they do business. The third is looking at climate transition plans and not just targets, but how it is you're going to achieve that. And finally, the fourth being engaging in your supplier network, looking at your value chain. So it's not just you as a standalone company, but who it is that you're procuring from and how it is you engage with them.
But let me bring all those together because you say very early on, companies reduce their impact but remain competitive.
Indeed. And what we're seeing is actually when you surface this data, it comes back into your core business objectives. And of course, profitability cannot be ignored. Profitability has actually been boosted by companies who look into their supply chain, engage there, start considering how it is that their suppliers can do better business, more sustainable business, lowering their energy costs, thinking about a new energy mix, considering how it is that they can reinvest in factories going forward that actually produce better, more efficient outputs. All of this is comprised in that number that you mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, which is we've looked at our supply chain members, those 300 of some of the world's largest procurement offices around the world, and they've lowered their costs by $13 billion in identifying sustainable opportunities for their supply chain. So that profit and that efficiency is being driven by this same data set.
What I'm trying to get to is how what you've discovered should be driving a degree of positivism or optimism. I mean, you say that companies that take a leadership position drive change. In other words, why are they not driving much more change with these positives?
Well, it is the age-old question. I mean, we've been talking about sustainability and the state of global warming for many, many years, decades. So it's a question of how is it that we as an overall economy and an overall society starts thinking, well, what is it that the corporates can do? What is it that that governments can do? What is it that regulators can do? What is it our consumers can do? And CDP is really focused on making sure that we're surfacing the information about corporates. How is it that they're not doing more? Why are we not further ahead in terms of being able to, set a better climate trajectory overall? And part of this is that we are still on a journey. So yes, we're very proud of having 2/3 of the world's market capitalization reporting through CDP. However, those first 2 years yielding a 7 to 10% decrease in emissions is something to applaud. What happens after the second year? Well, it gets more complicated. And perhaps it also gets more long term in terms of how it is you're starting to see the implications, the benefits, the outcomes of making capital adjustments and CapEx changes today. So again, I think that
Sherry,
there's a patience that we need.
forgive me, shouldn't that 7 to 10% reduction in costs be a real inspiration in a competitive world?
So it's a 7 to 10% reduction in emissions, and it does inspire. And it is one of the key triggers for companies that are perhaps some of the largest multinationals in the world to talk about that with their suppliers in various places around the world, where that's just the beginning of their disclosure journey. So that ricochet and that amplification effect is something that we have been seeing accelerate over the course of the last 5 or 6 years. And that's where we're seeing sort of these incremental changes in some of the basic hard to abate sectors, including steel, including cement, and energy itself.
Now, I've heard you say that's a couple of times, I would invest in that all day and every day. In other words, it's something to be encouraged by, to actually get over the dragging of feet by what you call the laggards who are out there.
Yeah, and I'll give you a few numbers. We like numbers, we like data. If we look at Europe alone, we've identified over the past 5 years 3.47 trillion euros worth of opportunity that could be unlocked. And this is through our questions. So we don't just talk about greenhouse gas emissions or water usage. We also ask companies how it is that they're looking at a sustainable business model. And that 3.47 trillion is something pretty exciting to have a look at. The question we should ask is how much might that cost? Of course, you need to make sure that you're keeping this in the reality of profitability. And what we identified was it was only about $650 billion worth of cost to unlock that 3.47 trillion. That's what I would invest in all day, every day. And how can we make sure that that data gets in the hands of the C-suite, the board of directors, those that are actually funding the opportunities of the future?
And what's the answer to your own question about how you get that in their minds, across their desks, around the board table as well?
Yeah, so at CDP, we really lean into making sure that we are part of the financial value chain as well. So about 650 of the world's largest financiers are part of our network. They are the ones that are requesting this data. And what CDP is here to do is to make sure that we are actually giving them the data that actually is not just about risk mitigation. It's also about unlocking those opportunities and understanding how it is that we can capacity build in one of the most meaningful, impactful areas, which is moving capital at scale. If you are funding it, you're actually making a big difference. And if we can actually capacity build on how it is that the financial institutions are thinking about allocating capital in new product sets, we're already seeing some of that happening. It's about supply chain financing for good, sustainable supply chains. It's about thinking about CapEx for energy mix changes that is actually going to secure the profitability of those businesses going forward, and really making sure that we're talking the language of business, because that's what's getting funded.
But I need to keep pressing you on this because you talk it right at the beginning of chapter 1, a shortage of ambition. And I use that word again. You're facing a lot of laggards out there, people who don't really want to grip the enormity. Why does it take so long? Why is it not so convincing to those who need to be convinced? In other words, you've got the data in front of you. They've got the data in front of them. Why don't they want to be convinced by it?
Well, I think this is a philosophical and societal question. Of course, CDP works globally. So making, generalizations across cultures and across economies is difficult. However, one of the things that we have seen that does move the needle and does get the attention of both investors as well as business people is thinking about market capitalization and thinking about growth. How is it that companies that are leaders are getting rewarded? And I'll draw the attention of globally the transportation sector. If you map the leaders in the transportation sector versus the laggards on the basis of the data that we've collected, the leaders are getting a bump of about 12% in their market capitalization versus the laggards. And why is that? Let's ask the questions. Let's really try and get underneath some of that. And part of that is policy. We all have been talking about electric vehicles. We've all been talking about electrification of the grid, thinking about how transportation is changing and evolving. So possibly the answer to your question is, how can we have a whole of economy approach that includes policy making that is good for business, but also is very directional in terms of being able to use that data that's being surfaced so that you're taking advantage of those opportunities, as opposed to just looking at them and thinking, do we do that now? Policy can be a kickstart.
The reason I'm asking that is you have one phrase where you say most progress is, quote, when the planet is at the heart of the boardroom. That suggests to me, and I think it's confirmed by your data, that too often and too frequently it is simply nowhere near the heart of the boardroom.
I think that is a true fact. I think we saw a spike in the number of ESG committees that were sitting around board tables. That's fallen off a little bit. What I would hope is that some of that knowledge about tracking KPIs on the impact of a business on the natural world, on resources, but also on air quality and carbon emissions. Hopefully, all of that starts getting embedded in business as usual. But until that is actually raised up into the board level and thinking about tracking KPIs there, it may not actually be playing as much influence on business decisions as we would like. So there is still a gap, and we're doing all we can together with an ecosystem that are part of the NGO not-for-profit community, as well as the business and the consulting community, trying to understand how can we upskill board directors to ask questions so that they're actually making a whole of economy decision that secures their business future, not just the future of the planet.
Let me press the question in a different way, because you answer it in a different way in your report. You say only 1 in 10 companies are embedding Earth positive decision making through their business models. We're being positive here. You've got positive evidence, but only 1 in 10. That's a small number.
It is, and of course, we're doing this on the basis of the data that we are surfacing. So if we are trying to get that, 100% increase, so 2 out of 10 of companies that are embedding it, how do we do that? We build that over time. CDP has been doing this job for 25 years. And we're building that momentum in order to be able to really create the capacity that's needed at the top. I think it's all about understanding how you use data. Surfacing it and making sure that it is being utilized by your C-suite and by your procurement offices and your financial team. It takes time. So I think that's where we're seeing that, before, it was less than 1 out of 10. So we are seeing progress. It's just, is it fast enough? I think we need to celebrate the fact that we are raising this to the attention of those that can take it forward and embed it in their future planning.
Well, you answer your question in your own way. You say it's not fast enough by any means, even though, again, we're being positive. Let me try a different tack then, because one of the things you say is that linking executive pay to climate goals is important for changing the mindset.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It is one of the 4 levers that we see as being absolutely indicative of where climate leaders are actually making the most progress. And we're seeing that in a lot of studies. So this is something that echoes what the rest of the world is also seeing, which is that a CEO, a board, a CFO, having their executive pay, their bonus, is linked to some of these sustainability goals as well. Now, is this getting closer to what people call a triple bottom line or a double bottom line or multiple materiality? Frankly, we can use whichever phraseology is working. Nomenclature is not the point here. The point is actually making sure that those C-suites are actually are prioritizing their sustainability goals as well as profitability. And there's proof points that these two things can coexist.
Now, you talk about one very important limitation here about the ever more demanding regulation and market expectation, the fiduciary responsibility, in other words, for publicly quoted companies. How much do you think that really is a dampener? Because they easily default to saying, we're under so much pressure on so many regulatory issues, we can't move at the speed that is necessary. How much do you think that's a genuine excuse? How much do you think it's rather flip?
Well, I think that there's different layers of regulatory responsibility and compliance that businesses are considering. From a CDP level, we are celebrating the fact that the world is looking at how disclosures, ESG disclosures, environmental, natural capital disclosures are becoming part of the compliance framework. And what we've seen that do is actually move some of the work about trying to raise this data into the CFO's office. It becomes a compliance activity. And that's not a nice to have any longer. That's a must have. Then it becomes a question of if you are complying with a disclosure only regulation, that actually is an incredible burden to companies. What you want is you want to surface that data. Maybe it's for compliance that's becoming the initial reason for doing so, but that data should be embedded in the work that you do in your core business. And that's the piece that answers your question, which is, how is it that you can argue with companies who say that this is just a big burden and there's so much compliance in various different ways of us doing our business? Adding an environmental and sustainability burden to this is a problem. Actually, the argument should be that you have to raise this information and use it multiple ways. Use it to unlock your access to capital. Use it for your customers and being able to win and retain business. Use it to retain your talent and being able to actually showcase that this is something that's important to you as a business and you hold dear. It's the same data point. It's not a different data point. So you might as well make sure that you're actually leveraging it. So we see that as being sort of an argument that we can make. And companies that are starting to embrace that are asking, what more data should we use? How is it we can become even more transparent? And actually, that's where CDP works hand in glove with thinking about what's next.
We've got about a couple of minutes left, Sherry. Let me ask you about what your prediction is about where things are going, because you make a rather sobering analysis here. Just under half, 49% of disclosing companies are meeting the minimum. Where do you think that might get to in a year or two?
So I think that compliance, as I referenced, is a helping hand for this, albeit that is not 100% clear, where the world is going in various jurisdictions in terms of making compliance mandatory. However, I think that there is a growing understanding that these data points are actually securing future competitiveness. So if we're the biggest driver of CDP's growth in terms of building and surfacing data is that customers are asking their clients, customers are asking their whole supply chain globally for data on how it is that they are affecting sustainability and the natural world. And I don't see that abating at all. I see that growing from year to year, more suppliers being added to that list. So it says to me that this is shifting from a nice to have, something we might consider, to I need you to have this in order to win business. I need to stay on that docket in that universe. And that's incredibly compelling. I think the other trend that I want to make sure we don't lose here is also nature. So it's not just about climate and thinking about carbon. And actually, this is the reason why we changed our name from Carbon Disclosure Project to CDP. We've been calculating and looking at and surfacing information on forestry, land use, thinking about oceans, thinking about water for over a decade. And now that is becoming a really big trend in the future because it's actually business critical. You need water as an input to so many economic outputs. And that is actually refocusing the business mind on, wait a minute, actually some of this stuff is not free and actually affecting the natural world is affecting my bottom line and my costs. And that actually refocuses the whole world.
Let me just ask you this finally. How worried are companies about proudly revealing their achievements for fear of being accused, frankly, of being too woke? In other words, they're worried about a backlash.
I think that right now there is a pivot that's happening in the world. That companies are thinking about what it is that they want to shout about in a economically turbulent time. And what we're seeing is that those that are have been talking about sustainability are continuing to talk about sustainability, but maybe they're using slightly different words. They're starting to use words like competitiveness. They're starting to use words like resilience. They're starting to use words like risk appetite and being able to actually mitigate risk. Frankly, we all should be celebrating the fact that that is part of the new nomenclature going forward. So I think we just need to listen harder about what it is that companies are talking about and actually mainstreaming the fact that sustainability is part of a both risk and opportunity matrix that businesses are talking about should be celebrated.
And certainly the language and the description are something we talk about all the time at Thinking the Unthinkable as a restraint. If the language is changed, there's a good chance that people will feel warmer towards it. Final thought in 30 seconds, if you can, Sherry. What's your message then to those who are out there watching this saying, I think I want to go down this track. What more do I need to do? 30 seconds.
Well, the best time to have started to think about your disclosure and the data that you need to run a sustainable business was 25 years ago. The second best time is now. There's no reason to be able to not start that journey. And if you start with only a few data points, you're going to see the benefit and embed it into your business. And that's going to win you more business, more investors, more retention of your talent. And you're going to give you a clear view of where it is that your role in sustainable business going forward can be. So start today.
Sherry Madera, thank you so much. You can reference every detail that Sherry's given us. A transcript of the podcast is posted in parallel on our website, along with contact details for us and Sherry at CDP. Do please join us when we next have our conversation about Thinking the Unthinkable. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you'll find plenty of other podcasts, very much in the same vein of frankness. So from me, Nik Gowing, until the next time, keep thinking unthinkables. More than ever, it's both possible and necessary. From Sherry and me, bye-bye.